Hello everyone, welcome to our next training video in the I Believe series, which is about knowing God, trusting in God, and living for God. And the particular subject we're going to look at is probably what I would consider and personally believe to be the heartbeat of the Christian faith, and it is God as Trinity. In many ways, this video cannot exhaust the immensity of the subject. I mean, you have the leader's notes, which gives you a bit of detail. There are some excellent Christian books out there. In many ways, we won't be able to exhaust it in this training video, but really all we're going to try and do is just highlight what it means, God is Trinity, from the text. Of course, there's no explicit passage where the Trinity is sort of like the main theme. It's sort of embedded in every single text and letter of particularly the New Testament, and it's everywhere actually when you start looking for it. But pray that God would help us as we convey this message. Herman Bavinck, for example, the Dutch theologian, put it that when you look at false teachings or false Christian practices, often at the root of it is a misunderstanding of God as Trinity. So this is really a foundational subject, and it's really about our God, whose relationship, who is community yet three persons. And so pray that God would help us to understand and grasp what it means, God is Trinity. But getting into the subject, our basic belief is that we worship one God who is three persons, or as the classic definition, one substance but three persons who are equally God, fully God. And in many ways, here's just a brief overview. We believe that the Trinity is assumed or sort of implicit in the Old Testament text, though not clear from the beginning, but there are some hints towards it. So for example, the creation account, we clearly see a plurality in God. God speaking, let us. That's a recurring theme in Genesis 1, 3, and 11. But also the references to the Spirit. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and then you have this reference to the Spirit who's hovering over the face of the waters. And the Word being active. And in a very poetic way, in the Psalms, the Word is personified and even worshipped and described as the agent of creation. But also we have this messenger of the Lord, which the Old Testament often translates as the angel of the Lord. And he's a unique character in the Old Testament, particularly because it references him as the messenger of the Lord or the angel of the Lord. And yet when he speaks, it is Yahweh, God himself, who speaks. And many commentators think and consider him as a sort of a personification or visible manifestation of God. And a great example is in Exodus chapter 3. We have numerous references to the Spirit of God throughout the Old Testament. Numbers 11:25 to 29 is just an example. But also the continual emphasis in the Old Testament is that God alone is God. He is one. Deuteronomy 6 is a classic text. The Ten Commandments is another. But it's all over the place. So you've got this plurality within God, and yet He is a unity. He is one. He alone is God. And that's just an important thing to see in the Old Testament. But this mystery that's hidden or implicit in the Old Testament really becomes clearer in the New Testament. It's more revealed. And it even starts in John's Gospel this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, so He is distinct from God. He is in relationship with God, partnering with God, and yet at the same time the Word was God. That's a very important point. He is distinct from God, and yet He is God as well. He was with God in the beginning. And for example, another example of this is just in John's Gospel, which refers to the advocate. Interesting enough, in 1 John, Jesus is referred as the advocate. And here we have, speaking of, I will send to you from the Father. So interesting, Jesus will send from the Father the Spirit of truth. And interesting, in John 14, it's the Father who sends the Spirit in Jesus' name. And interesting, the word truth, Jesus calls himself the truth. So there's a strong link between the Spirit and Jesus and the Father. In the Bible, we have, for example, in Matthew 28, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are given one name. Baptize them in the name singular of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. The name Yahweh. They're all God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A beautiful verse that just shows the diversity within God, His roles, as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, is this little passage here in 1 Peter 1:2, who has been chosen, this is the church, chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ, sprinkled with His blood. And here we see the distinct roles of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's the Father who foreknew, it is the Son who has atoned for them, and it is the Spirit who sanctifies them for the Son and the Father. And so just here in an overview, we have this picture of one God, the name, as we see here, and yet three persons, very clearly from the text. But just the passage you're going to look at, and really all we're asking for is just notice. What we're looking at now is not the main theme or idea of John 14, don't mistake it, but all over the place it's implied that God is three in one. So for example, the blue just highlights words about Jesus, and you'll notice that there are three persons described in John. So just in our little passage here, we have, for example, Jesus referring to himself the whole time, me, I, continuing I, and his function, I am the way and the truth and the life, his role. You come to the Father through him. If you've seen him, you've seen the Father. He speaks to us. But interesting enough, not on his own authority. Everywhere here scattered throughout, we have this referral to Jesus and his role, I, and his function. What he's come to do is to prepare a place for us. And he will come back and he'll take us to be with him. So Jesus continually refers to himself. He is a person, I. But simultaneously with Jesus, we have the referral to the Father. A very unique little phrase is, believe in God, notice, and believe in me. What's Jesus saying? There's a link between Jesus and God, but Jesus is distinct as well from God. He refers to his Father. And again, my Father, the Father. And through Jesus, you know him and have seen him. So again, there's a distinction between the Father and the Son, Jesus, and yet they are one. You must believe in both. And very importantly, the reason is, which is defined in red, is because they're actually one God. Notice what he says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Again, the Father living in me. And again, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Jesus is showing that they are mutually indwelling one another. They are one being, one essence. In John chapter 10, verse 30, he puts it this way, I and the Father are one. And yet they are distinct. There are distinct persons, the Father and Jesus, or the Father and the Son, and yet they are one God who needs to be believed in. And notice very carefully the Father's role in this. It is the Father's work. It is the Father's voice or words. And Jesus only does what his Father wants him to do. So it's the Father who commands, and it is the Son who obeys. And yet it's through the Son, Jesus, that we come to the Father, and it's through the Son that we see the Father. And here you see that distinction, yet unity between the Father and the Son, in what we call the Trinity. But interesting enough, notice in the latter part of this chapter, the Spirit is introduced. Again, in blue, Jesus asks the Father for the Spirit. Notice it's Jesus who will not leave us, but he will come to us. And it's Jesus who will live so that we will live, referring to his resurrection. It's Jesus' words we are called to follow and keep and obey and believe. But notice this, the Father will give you or send an advocate, another advocate. In 1 John, Jesus is referred to the advocate, and he is the Spirit of truth. Here we have another person, but closely linked with Jesus, who is the truth, the Spirit. And interesting enough, it's through the Spirit he will be with us and he will be in us. But notice this, when the Spirit indwells God's people, he says, on that day you will realize that I am in the Father and you suddenly are in me and I am in you through the Spirit. So suddenly through the Spirit, we are invited into the very presence or being of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And interesting enough, it's through the Spirit, as we believe and trust in Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, that the Father will love them. And notice this, we will come to them and make our home with them. A reference back to chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. See, we see this incredible idea that through the Spirit, of course, remember, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit mutually indwell one another. They are one being, one presence. And through the indwelling of the Spirit in us, literally, God, who is Trinity, dwells in us, makes his home within us, his people. And again, here we see another role of the Spirit. Apart from this idea of presence and indwelling us, he will also teach his disciples all things and remind them of everything Jesus has said. It's the Father, of course, who sends him. And very importantly, what he reminds them of, what he teaches them, is Jesus' words and Jesus' works. And maybe just at the end, just to highlight the fact, it's the Father who commands. It's the Son who obeys and loves his Father. And it's the Spirit who is sent by the Father and the Son, who then reminds them and teaches them. And really, all we're trying to highlight in this one passage is we notice there is only one God, but this one God is three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, mutually indwelling one another, simultaneously each having their own distinct roles in God's purposes and plans, each loving one another, each willingly obeying and caring and delighting in one another. And ultimately the plan is that we would be invited and become part of, or invited into, this very presence of God, this unity of love and joy, and that we would be part of it as well. And that's what Jesus has come to do. He is the way and the truth and the life into God. Look, this is complex, but just highlighting with the yellow and the blue and the green that there are three persons, and the red, but they are one. And that's really all we need to see. They are one, but three. And really what people need to get is just the reality of the Trinity in the Scriptures, but also see how that relates to us as God's people, being the community of his presence. God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit mutually indwell us through the presence of the Spirit. And of course, if that's true, if God is among us, if we as his temple, as Ephesians puts it, we should actually all the more want to be together as God's people, practicing God's presence together with one another. And that is the blessed joy of the Christian life, is we are now within the circle of God's presence, of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this triune God. And I'd say that in essence is what we're trying to bring across with God as Trinity.